So we're at the World Ayahuasca Conference in Kilham, Spain 2019, and with us is Chris Kilham, who's an ethnobotanist, and we'll discuss everything from ayahuasca to ethnobotany. Can you begin with a continuation perhaps of your talk the other day?
Well, basically my talk was called Ayahuasca Sustainability from Vine to Cup. There's been persistent declaration among people in the ayahuasca scene that the vine is critically endangered, that the rainforest is being destroyed as a result of rampant over-harvesting of the vine in the wild, and that we're in great peril. And this persisted for many years, but really without any sort of data or studies or surveys to support it. So at the end of I guess it was 2017, there was yet, one more series of articles basically repeating this, and it was very clear that everybody was just kind of, repeating the same things that they'd read from other people who were misinformed. So I decided, after conversation with my wife, that it was time to do a sustainability study, focused in Peru. I was already aware that UDV in Brazil and Santo Daime in Brazil had sophisticated cultivation programs, but I wanted to find out about wild harvesting and cultivation in the Peruvian Amazon, which is really an epicenter for people going down to experience ayahuasca. And to kind of cut it short, what my team and I discovered over the course of about 2 years of inquiry was that there is, at present, a completely ample supply of wild ayahuasca vine. There are harvesters who've been harvesting for 30 years, 25 years, with whom we spoke, who, told us about or took us to these areas, and there was really a superabundance of vine. At the same time, we see more and more and more people cultivating. One cultivator has 6,000 vines. He's never bought any plants, he never will. And he's really the global exception, I'd have to say. But many of the larger ayahuasca centers have caught on to the fact that the future is going to be growing your own garden, if you will, of these medicinal plants. And so several of them have cultivation efforts underway, a Temple of the Way of Light, Ayahuasca Foundation, Francisco Montes, and others. They're not waiting for the future. So my summary conclusion after all the work that we did in Peru is that there's an ample supply right now, and that there's no future at all without cultivation, and that cultivation should start today.
You mentioned something in your talk the other day about how you've seen it happen so many times that Westerners go out to the Amazon and they drink maybe a half dozen times, and then they take the brew back and they start serving, and it can have potentially disastrous consequences. And you likened it to someone going to a surgery room and watching surgery performed a few times.
Yeah, or watching the TV show ER and then deciding that they can perform an appendectomy. Shamanistic practice is a sophisticated skill. And I'm not suggesting at all that non-indigenous people can't learn shamanism. In fact, it's very evident that they can. I don't think that the methodology and the techniques are, let's say, limited to one cultural group or another. But the capacity to learn them. But I would say that it's very dangerous for people who go to, let's say a talented shaman like Ricardo Amaringo or Estela Pangoza, and then they go, well, I brought a liter of ayahuasca back, and I'm going to get, 15 people together and charge $100, and I can do this. And I'll place a cassette of, or I guess there are no cassettes anymore, I'll play a digital file of Icaros that I recorded on my iPhone, and I'll be the shaman. It's ridiculous. One of the things that happens with ayahuasca is that it amplifies everything. And we have to use our faculties of reason and discernment with this. I mean, if ayahuasca, for example, tells me that I'm the Messiah, I have to know that's complete and utter nonsense. I may be able to play some role within the gigantic mass of humanity to put out some valuable messages that may be useful to some people, but proportionate to the role that all human beings play in the world. And this idea of amplification, you sit in ayahuasca ceremony and you have this magnificent experience sometime of being this gigantic, spiritual, expansive being connected to all things and all humanity and sort of a gushing geyser of love and compassion. That is a valuable, perhaps life-changing experience, but don't confuse that with the practical realities of living in the world. Don't, put on a robe and a staff, get on a donkey and think you're Jesus. So similarly, don't go down and drink 3, 6, 20, 50, 100 times and think you're a shaman, because you're not. And while people can and do drink ayahuasca on their own, as far as I'm concerned, the guided experience with a highly trained shaman who has the capacity to, create a sacred space and a safe space, to initiate the ceremony, to serve a good quality brew and the right amount based on your experience, and then to guide that ceremony through the sacred songs, or with a shakapa or whatever is part of their tradition. This is technology. This is sophisticated knowledge. They sat in ceremony with their grandmother or their uncle or their father or their mother or their whoever for years as kids, and then they started to get trained, and then they started to be able to participate in ceremonies, and then years later they could lead them. If you want to go, if you go to the Amazon and you drink and you say, I hate it when I hear people say, I want to be a shaman. I have yet to hear very many people say, I want to spend the 10 years of absolutely hard work and apprenticeship that it's going to take, and to do all the dietas and to be down here and to get eaten alive, to eventually become worthy of the honor of leading ceremonies. I want to hear that language.
Wade Davis mentioned a couple of days ago that every single shaman he's met has some degree of psychosis, and having met dozens of shamans, they all say that they suffered from what might be described as, according to the Diagnostic Manuals of Mental Health, schizophrenia, if they ignore the calling to heal people through shamanic methods. Is this something that you'd agree upon and can elaborate on?
Well, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, this notion actually goes back to Mircea Eliade in his book many, many decades ago on shamanism. When Timothy Leary and Dr. Jerome Letvin argued on public television in the United States in '67, I think, famous dialogue between them. Jerome Letvin of MIT, Timmy Leary, formerly of Harvard, Tim in his, at that point, kind of white guru garb, and Jerome Letvin just kind of pissed off in a suit. Letvin said to him, how would you describe, and he basically outlined psychosis. And Timothy Leary responded, well, I would say then, the person was in a heightened mystical state, and he kind of went on like that. And Jerome Letvin destroyed, the rules of the Federal Communications Bureau. He couldn't take it. He just blurted out, bullshit, you'd say, and he kind of gave a DSM diagnosis. If you ask, it's all contextual. If you ask a person who is not on any form of psychedelic, what's up? And they say, well, I'm having visions of serpents in the room right now, and I'm hearing voices directing me to do things in the forest, you go, cuckoo, cuckoo. Okay. When somebody drinks ayahuasca, when somebody eats psilocybin, when somebody takes LSD, when somebody does the DMT containing psychoactive snuffs, they say, oh, you're having visions. So it's contextually acceptable. And so I can't disagree that the experiences that people have in the psychedelic space, I can't disagree that they're not identical many times to the experience, or the descriptions of psychotic thought and behavior. The difference is there a healing process that occurs? In other words, if I have an encounter with an anaconda, okay, the anaconda's right here, it's talking to me, it's blasting me with cosmic energy. This is in ayahuasca. If, as a result of that, I wind up being a more thoughtful, considerate, intelligent person, able to listen to others better, then that is a healing or educating experience, however weird it is. However utterly bizarre it is that that event would lead to that behavior or realization. If, on the other hand, I'm seeing serpents all the time, and the result is I'm in pain and turmoil and agony, and I'm confused, and everybody around me knows it, that's psychosis. That's a long answer.
What advice could you give to someone who's reached rock bottom and is maybe having suicidal ideation, addiction problems, but is terrified to try ayahuasca?
Well, I think that some measure of fear about your first encounters with ayahuasca, or trepidation, or feeling very careful about it, is nothing but a smart idea. I mean, this is a head-first drop into the chipper shredder. This is not San Pedro, which is kind of like bright and friendly and wonderful. Oh God, the San Pedro is really strong, let's go swim in the river. It's not like that. It is thorough, it is immersive. If we have painful things that we're dealing with, maybe traumas that have prevented us from experiencing joy in our lives, those are extreme conditions that we somehow have to go through to get to a happier place. So having a fear of ayahuasca, and I don't mean an absolute terror, but I think a fear of it is intelligent. At the same time, you can ask yourself, well, am I willing to possibly suffer for a few hours, for a few nights, and maybe come to another side in which I feel like a more whole, sane, happy person, able to fulfill myself more easily and engage with the world? Or would I prefer to feel messed up and in pain for the remainder of my days? I think that, the sobriety of that choice could lead a lot of people to try ayahuasca, but it still has to be good ayahuasca with somebody highly trained in a safe environment, supported by people who know what to do.
It seems to be a common theme that ayahuasca allows people to come a lot closer to the acceptance of death.
Yeah.
And the dying process is often a phenomenon, an experience that occurs during the ayahuasca journey.
I've died in ceremony. Figuratively and literally. Figuratively, I had an experience that I was dead, and I was on the mat next to me was my wife, and I felt so sorry that I hadn't said goodbye to her. And I accepted that I was dead, and that I was in some sort of a transitional world, and I was kind of at peace with it, although disappointed that I hadn't been able to talk with Zoe first. And then I felt the ground against my back, and I said, well, I can't be dead if I'm feeling the ground against my back. That's not likely. And then I realized I wasn't dead. But the other time, which was within the same week, you know, my wife and I typically will check in with each other, you know, just like reach out and touch each other's hand, you know, hey, how you doing? Good, okay, fine. If you need anything, let me know. That kind of thing. And I hadn't checked in with her for about an hour and a half or so, so she reached out to touch my hand, and it was cold and it was like rubber. So she shook it a little, and nothing happened. So she shook it more, and nothing happened. So she sat up, and she shook my arm, and nothing happened. And then she got close and tried to find a pulse or breath, and there really wasn't any. And then she shook me, and nothing was going on. And then she got on top of me and really started to like do whatever she was doing. And because she's having her own experience, oh no, my God, you know, my husband's just died in an ayahuasca ceremony. And of course, because you think crazy things sometimes, she's like, what am I going to tell people? The medicine hunter died taking ayahuasca? That's a disaster. So she's having all these things. And then at a certain point, I just magically sat up. And I had actually been canceled for about an hour and a half. No thought, no sensation, no self-awareness. I mean, nothing. It was like before that period of time and after that period of time, you know, I had sensation, thought, whatever, but during that period of time, I was completely and utterly gone. And there was nothing. And that, how I translated that experience, which wasn't at all upsetting to me because I wasn't around for it. How I translated that experience was a total and complete reboot. You know, a death of sensation, a death of mind, a death of feeling, a death of self-identity, a death of everything. Nothing at all, total annihilation. And somehow, then with the restart, I was actually refreshed. So two kind of curious death experiences, but yeah, they happen. You gotta not mind dying.
Yeah. Are there any particular specific episodes that were troubling in your life that ayahuasca helped you transition through?
Well, I would say so. I mean, I initially went to ayahuasca because I was grieving too long over the death of my mother. I'd been grieving for about 14 months, and it just gotten completely unhealthy. And I wound up going down to the Peruvian Amazon to a place that Dennis McKenna had recommended to me, and having a spectacular healing experience the first night. I mean, the funny thing that it was Guillermo Arevalo who was leading the ceremonies at that time, and I drank for the first time, and he leaned over to me and he said, if you don't feel it, if it isn't strong enough, you can have more in about 45 minutes. I said, okay, that's good to know. And about 45 minutes later, I was on my back sobbing with laughter at the very idea that anybody would be idiot enough to drink more than that. It was like, I was so completely overwhelmed by the ayahuasca. But then shortly after, all of a sudden I was on the porch of my house with my mother. And we had this conversation, and it was utterly normal. There were no crocodiles, there were no anacondas, there wasn't light streaming from the sky. It was just a conversation with my mom. And when that ended, the grief was gone, and it never came back. Other circumstances in my life, my dad committed suicide when I was 19. We'd had a very rocky relationship. And so there were many ceremonies in which I came to terms with that in terms of forgiveness and understanding. And, you know, I wouldn't say that every single aspect of the experiences that I had with him are totally resolved, but I'd give it a good 95%. And that was due to some ceremonies in which, you know, different incidents or different circumstances came up, and I was able to process through them. So yeah, I can say for myself, certain traumas and certain grief have absolutely been either completely resolved or at least to the greatest extent thanks to participation in ayahuasca ceremonies.
Can you tell us about the recent documentary, The Preachers, I believe it's called?
Oh, God, this is so much fun. Actually, this television show, The Preachers, reached out to my wife Zoe initially. She's also involved with ayahuasca, asking, if we wanted to be on as a couple. And Zoe doesn't really like to do TV. And I said, but yeah, sure, I'll do it. So they flew me out to Los Angeles from Massachusetts. And basically the setup was this: 4 Southern Black Baptist evangelical Christian ministers and me, and the topic was ayahuasca, the God drug. Okay, so it was a real setup. And these guys were trying to be very open-minded and, encouraging thought from other sectors beyond, their Baptist beliefs. And I come from a family of ministers and broadcasters. I can talk church all day. And I disarmed them before the segment by saying, yeah, my grandfather's a minister, my uncle's a minister, my cousin's a minister, my great uncle was a minister. And they're like, oh, okay, this isn't just like some drug-crazed guy who staggered out of the forest. He's got this background in Christianity. And, but basically, as we got talking, they wanted to know about this. And at one point I said, look, you guys make a really big deal out of the fact that Moses saw a burning bush 2,000 years ago. You're going to see a burning bush in your first half hour on ayahuasca. Well, that was just, it was just too much for them. And, I asked them, wouldn't you like to meet Jesus now? Because you really can if you want to. And that was the capper. It was like, I don't want to meet my Lord and Savior till I die. That was how they settled out on it. But I found, I have to say, I found them wonderfully respectful. And I know they tried with everything they had to be open-minded to what I had to offer. And it was also, admittedly kind of comical. So you can Google ayahuasca, the God drug, and watch the 7-minute segment that I do. And it's pretty good ayahuasca comedy, I gotta say.
I was going to ask, do you have any thoughts around the coevolution between the vine and Psychoactive viridis and our, internal neurotransmitter network from an ethnobotanical perspective?
Well, the coevolution. In the Amazon rainforest, you've got about 80,000 higher plants that we know of. And as we know, plant intelligence, not to be confused with plant cognitive thought, is pervasive throughout the entire biosphere. And it really does seem to be that in South America, to the best extent that we know, we have the greatest concentration of DMT-containing plants of any place on Earth. And the mystery or the question that botanists and anthropologists and all kinds of people have had was, how did somebody take this one of 10,000 different kinds of vines and this one of 80,000 leafy plants and say, this vine, this plant, chop a shitload of this, put it in a pot, get a whole bunch of this stuff, add water, cook it for 8 hours until it's a really nasty dark muck, and drink some. Trial and error from a statistical standpoint doesn't work. It only works if you accept the shaman's explanation, and the shaman's explanation is, the plants told us. So that's a kind of a backdoor way of answering your question, of saying that there is a field of intelligence. And we don't know how long ayahuasca vine has existed. It's very hard to get historic remnants from the Amazon rainforest because everything decays and disappears back down to its fundamental, elements. We don't know how long chacruna or huambisa or any of these DMT-containing plants has existed. But we do know that within the biosphere, or certainly within the Amazonian field of life, there has been communication enough among these plants that people have been able to garner knowledge about what to use. And so, you know, their coevolution, I don't know. How we found out about them, they told us.
Maybe a final question. What is your opinion on like the entities and demons and etc. that one might see during the ayahuasca ceremony? Do you think it might be purely like your cultural projections of your like unconscious, or do you think it taps into something deeper, maybe your ancestral experience or something even more non-local?
I think there's no either or proposition here. I think that, you know, the Tibetans describe different types of dreams. One type of dreaming, they just, I mean, this is my language, but they just describe it as head salad. Just stuff. It doesn't have any sensibility to it. It's not necessarily meaningful. And then there are dreams that somehow have to relate to the circumstances in your lives and you can learn from them. And then there are these special, impactful, rare, you know, dreams of divinity, of inspiration, of mystic consciousness that can be revelatory and life-changing. I think within the sphere of the beings that we might see, I mean, you know, it gets complicated with ayahuasca because you share visions. Okay, I've been in ceremony where all of a sudden everybody at the same time goes, what the hell's with all the snakes all of a sudden? Okay, everybody's seeing snakes all at once. How do you deal with that? I had one experience in ayahuasca where before ceremony began, these gigantic dog-sized spiders were moving toward everybody's mat. And I was having none of it, and I like stood up and prayed some things and they went away. And later on, I told Ricardo Amaringo, yeah, you know, there were these gigantic spiders, and he said, yeah, we had to clean them out before we could start singing. I think some of it's projection of mind. I think some of it is shared vision in ways that we don't understand how that occurs, except that we're basically all part of the same field of intelligence. And I think some of it is pure inspiration. I mean, I get this anaconda that comes to me all the time. And it has taught me and has done things to me and it has energized me and has inspired me. Is it real? I don't even think that's a pertinent question. I think what we can take away from these visions of demons or angels or anything is, what can I learn from that? What's the effect? And a shaman gave me a good piece of advice. He said, set the idea before ceremony that any entity that is wise and kind and has your best interests at heart is welcome in, and every other has to stay out. And when I'm in ceremony, there are some beings that come close, and then it's almost like they hit that invisible fencing and they kind of skim off and they go away, and then others just come in. So I don't know if that really answers it for you, but those are some thoughts about what I think this is, and hopefully we take away meaning.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's my great pleasure. Thanks.